there's lots more people just joining us now, which is wonderful. So welcome everyone to this very cold morning's breakfast at Sky. I would like to thank you all for attending. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Turtle Island and that this is Treaty 1 land and the traditional territory of Dakota, Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So a few housekeeping items before I introduce today's speaker, Deborah Dykstra. So just a reminder that today's session will be recorded. So for those of you that miss it, it should be up on the Breakfast at Sky website. You can let any colleagues know if they're unable to attend this morning. It should be up within a few weeks. So that means that if you don't want to be part of the recording, I'll ask that you turn your cameras off. And at the end of the session, there will be some time for questions, and we won't be recording that session. So I would like to encourage you to turn your cameras on, unmute yourself, and feel free to ask a question, knowing that that won't be up on the website. If you prefer, you can please enter those questions into the chat box, and I'd be happy to relay those questions at the end as well. So today we are here for the topic and the title, Remembering Together, Supporting Personal Storytelling in Children with Autism. And I would like to thank Deborah Dykstra for completing or giving us this talk today. Our objective, so what we're going to learn about is the role of personal storytelling in social development, relationships, and learning, considering developmental delays and differences in children with autism that can impact our personal storytelling, and learn effective conversational strategies to support children's engagement and growth. So Deborah Dykstra is just completed her Master's of Education degree just recently with some support at Sky Center. She is the mother of 2 teenagers on the autism spectrum, both clients at Sky. She is currently teaching grade 3 here in Winnipeg, and in her spare time, she coordinates Winnipeg's Next Chapter book clubs, which offer a place for people of all abilities to enjoy books and reading together. So thank you so much for joining us today, Deborah, and I will turn this presentation over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Just double check that that's working. So thank you very much for having me. Just a second here. There we go. Okay, you've already shared this, but I do just want to thank the people at Sky who were instrumental in this project that I was able to do as part of my master's degree. Stephanie Matthews and Kellyanna Clinton were partnering with me. And this, of course, the Sky Research Ethics Board was very supportive in their feedback and in offering time at the center. And so I just, I'm very grateful for that support. So just to give an overview of where I'm going to go, 3 parts to this presentation. I'm going to start out by just explaining how this idea came and what the research background is, just a very short introduction to that. I'm going to share the strategies that we offered parents and then let you know how things turned out. Okay. So this actually started for me through an article that was handed to me by Leanne Belton. And she gave me an article that was about personal narrative for children on the autism spectrum and how important that can be for developing not just language, but also social connections. And it was something that I hadn't thought about a lot before. I did know as a parent of children on the autism spectrum that language development can be a very challenging thing, and that in the early years when I was with my children, it was very hard to figure out how to engage with them conversationally because of their language delay. So I found this article very fascinating, just to think about the idea that for children whose language is delayed, there might be a possibility of going back to earlier stages of the way parents and children interact and regaining some of that lost ground. I also read in that article about how important personal narrative is just for life, and for social connection and for identity. Um, Personal narrative, being able to tell people about things that have happened to you, has a huge impact on your memories, on your self-concept, on the way you interact with other people. A very high percentage of the conversations that we have with other people is made up of us telling stories about what's happened to us. And I remember sitting in a coffee shop thinking about this and just listening to the people all around me and just thinking, okay, what are people talking about in here? And it was true. If you sort of listen on, well, we can't do that anymore, but in a coffee shop or a situation where people are meeting together to reconnect, what you hear is people telling stories. And the other thing that really struck me is that there's an educational connection, because we make sense of what we read and what we learn about in the context of our own experiences. And then also advocacy, because how do we, as a teen or as an adult or as a child, how do we communicate to people what we need unless we can tell them what has happened to us? And, obviously it's easy to think of situations where that is relevant. What if we have a traffic accident and we have to explain our perspective to MPI? What if we're going to the doctor and we need to explain where we hurt and when it started? What if we're a child in a school setting and we're in trouble because we got into a disagreement with another child and we have to be able to explain our perspective to the teacher who's trying to negotiate this and guide towards a good outcome? So if you can't do that, if you can't explain your perspective, then there are a whole lot of holes in your ability to manage your life and to build those connections. So just a quick definition. What do we mean when we're talking about parents and children talking together? Reminiscing is a good word, which means that, and just unpacking that a little bit, reminiscing would be an evaluative recounting of memories. So it's not just saying what happened, it's also putting your own perspective and your ideas on what those events mean to you. And that's a really important point, as you will see. Stories are not just about facts or a list of events. They're embedded in emotional shifts. And I will talk about that some more. Now, when a child has autism, there's a couple of things that are going on. As I imagine many of you will know, a language delay is a really obvious difference. But also we know that for young children on the autism spectrum, joint attention is a difficult thing. And that's something that often therapists will want to work on between parents and children. How do you help your child pay attention to the same things that you are paying attention to? And how do you negotiate that together? Because it shouldn't always be what you're interested in. You want to be paying attention to what your child is interested in at the same time so that you can have an interaction around that thing. And that is just as relevant in conversation as it is in nonverbal play. For children with autism, there is often a difference in the way the parent-child relationship is kind of negotiated. So what happens, and I certainly can say that I've experienced this, is you figure out what works. Because the things that you want to naturally do, the conversations you want to have, the interactions you want to have, don't always work in the way that you expect them to. And so what often happens is we have a shift from inviting a child to participate or waiting for their invitation to engage with them, to using more directive language. So it's easier to get a response if you're very clear and simple and you tell a child what to do or you prompt them in what to say. And that has an impact on the natural flow of how conversations develop. And I think there's a bit of a flow here, sort of a, I won't call it a vicious circle, but a self-perpetuating cycle. So if the child responds less to conversation, that means that changes our expectations on what a child can say and do and leads us to use more directive language, which means the child has fewer chances to observe more typical, more natural, more elaborative conversations and to practice, which leads to less conversation and so on. So the question in my mind was, can we break this cycle at a later point? Which I will get to. There's a fairly large body of research that looks at the differences in children with autism who are verbal, but are still telling stories, but comparing them between children with autism and children who are typically developing. And what has been observed is that children with autism will have less content in their stories. They recall fewer details. And there's often a point. They're often missing the point of the story. You know, sometimes, well, and this happens with typical children too, sometimes a child will just kind of go on and you'll be waiting and wondering what their point is and what they're getting to. This is more common in children with autism. So they're lacking cause and effect. Their sequence might be out of order, but most of all, they're not using that elaborative function of storytelling, that evaluative function of storytelling, where they're thinking about what the story means to them. And there can be fewer expressions of emotion as well. So something that you listen for in a story is an emotional shift, which means you've gotten to the key point. And a really good example of this is telling jokes. Jokes are a form of stories. And a good joke has an emotion shift in it, where you have that moment of surprise, and that's where you get the point. So that's a good way to think about it. But children with autism won't use those as much. As I said, language development and narrative development depends on the interaction between adults and children. And so the question for me and the question for others is, if we change the way that parents interact with their children when they have had time to develop a little bit more beyond the early childhood years, can we make some changes? I found a study that is referenced at the end of this PowerPoint that did exactly that. There was a researcher in Boston who said, let's take some parents and children on the autism spectrum. Let's give the parents some strategies and let's compare the quality of the children's narratives before and after. And let's also look at the kind of behavior that the parents use as they are talking with their children before and after the training. This was interesting to me because it was done with children who were teenagers. And so, you know, we worry often about making a difference early on in a child's life. And we worry that if you know, past a certain point, maybe it's too late. But this researcher came to the conclusion, her name is Alyssa McCabe, she came to the conclusion that no, actually, you can make changes in the way parents and children interact with each other by giving them some information and some training, even later in their childhood, even into early adulthood. So I decided to try and do something similar, but with slightly younger children. So I was using single case design, which means that I was using multiple families as partners in my research. And what we did is we took some baseline information, offered them the training, and then checked again at the end to see what had changed. And this means like in this model, I could use mixed methods. So I could use quantitative information to try and do some measurement of the kinds of statements and questions that parents were using before and after. And I could also use some descriptive observation, like surveys, um, information about the families, interviews, parent and child feedback, to see what they thought. And so that's what I did. And so this is just a quick little diagram to show you that we had 3 different groups, 3 different sets of families, and they were offered a seminar at 3 different time points, 2 weeks apart. And then we collected samples before and after the training. And at the very end, we had a focus group session with everyone who was able to come. And the questions I wanted to know, the questions I wanted to explore were, if parents are given information on how narrative works and what strategies they could use with their children, could they learn some new habits in the time frame of a couple of months? And could that be observed and recorded that might support their children's development? And the second question is, in response to changes in parents' behavior, would the children respond differently? And in the very short term, because changes in children's language development, we should expect that to take up to a year before we can really observe anything significant. But in this very short term, would there be any hints that anything was changing for the children? And the third question is, what did the participants think? How useful did they find these strategies to be? So I'm gonna, before I tell you what the results of the study were, I'm going to give you a sense of what exactly we told them to do. And I will say that what we found is that the families were at a really diverse set of starting points. So there were some children that all were verbal, all used oral language to communicate, but some were much more fluent than others. And the age range was from 8 to 15, but that didn't really correlate with language development. So the strategies that each family used kind of depended on where they were at in their starting point. And I think it's really important to make that point, that giving a family all of the information that I'm going to give you in very brief form right now is overwhelming. So I think it's really important to get a sense of what people's starting points are before you start to work on this. But I will say that the general approach was gradual release. So that means we wanted parents to model, first of all and foremost. And if that's all they ever started doing in the scope of this study, then that was enough. But hopefully they would be able to move into doing together with their child what they were doing. And that's why I really like the title of my study, Remembering Together. This wasn't about a parent directing a child in what to do. This was about figuring out how to do things in collaboration. So first step, and this was big. This was really a big step for most of the families that we worked with, is just figuring out a time to connect with between parent and child. And it didn't have to be formal. It could be at any point during the day. Some of the things that people chose to do were to talk in the car, or at bedtime during the bath, or some families set up a time right after supper. There was one family that structured this time with a journal that looks like this, actually. I went and bought a copy. It's full of questions that can be related to personal experiences. And so the family would actually start their boys by having them write a sentence in answer to each question, and then put it down and start talking about it. And that worked well for them. That was probably the most formally organized family in the group. Some families talked while they were walking to and from school. Movement seemed to help. Doing activities while talking seemed to help. There were some recordings that were done with kitchen noises going on. So I think one family was talking while they were cooking supper. But that was really important. We gave every family a checklist or a form so that they could track the time that they were spending actually focusing on this activity. And I think every single family said this was not part of their family culture at the point that they started. So this was a push for all of them. This is just a quote from that family using the journal. And I had one family with siblings who were both on the spectrum, and one had consented to the study and the other didn't want to right away. But when he saw his brother and his mother doing the journal questions and talking and sharing memories, the second child decided he wanted to join in too. So that was kind of neat. Step 2 is tune into your own turning points. This is the way Stephanie Matthews worded it. And this is something that we're not aware of as adults, as people, as, busy parents. We don't necessarily think about how we tell stories and how we use stories through the day. And a personal story is not necessarily a big event. One parent was, right here. She said it could be something as small as, guess what? I tripped on my way to work today. And then her sons would want to know why she tripped. That's such a small, insignificant event, but you still have feelings about it. It's still a scary point in your day. And so that's all you really need is an event where you have something happens, you have a feeling, and then there's some kind of an outcome. That's all you need to think about when you're sharing with your child. And honestly, as a parent of 2 children with autism, I had stopped doing this because I wasn't getting the response that I had thought I should get from a child. I thought my children were not interested. And the parents in this study noticed fairly frequently and consistently that when they did start to tell these little stories to their children, then their children did start to respond, just as this parent did. So all stories start with emotions. That's key, because the emotion is where the meaning is. And here's another little sample. This one's actually my own. Talking to my son, who is fairly minimally verbal. He does talk, but he doesn't share his thoughts very much. But this just worked really well. I decided to try modeling a story, and I said, do you remember I accidentally put the wrong toothpaste on your toothbrush? And he smiled, so I kept going. And then I pulled in the emotion. I don't like your toothpaste, and you don't like mine. And then he responded with words, which is exactly what I was hoping he would do. Twice, I spit the toothpaste out, and then I asked him a question, and he answered it. So again, depending on where your starting point is, this could be a huge conversation. And it was for us. Here's another example. So mother says, I felt very bad that I promised to take you yesterday. We couldn't go. So that's why we're going today to the trampoline park. I was really disappointed myself. I really wanted to take you to the trampoline park, but that's okay. Sometimes it happens. And the child says, yeah. Mom says, things don't go as planned. And the child says, sometimes plans get changed. Yes, says mom, and we have to live with the change and accept the change, right? And the child says, sometimes we accept the change and sometimes we don't, This was an 8-year-old who really did struggle with conversation and with reasoning. And for him to say something like that was quite remarkable. Okay, which leads into modeling. You need to show a child how stories start. You need to share those little moments. You need to catch especially the things that happen that you both observe. And this was something that was really hard for parents to do. There weren't a whole lot of examples of stories that were shared where both parent and child were there for the event. But I still think it's really important and valuable because they then have the sensory information that goes with the story. They've seen it, they've heard it. If it was a scary or a funny moment, they've experienced it. So the example we used in the presentation was, you drop the hot dog and the dog eats it. And what you can do is, as soon as something silly like that happens, you can make the comment, whoops, okay, look, the dog ate my hot dog. I dropped it and he ate it, and now I have to go and get another hot dog. And that's an opportunity for reminiscing. If you can get a snapshot of an event, that's also very helpful. So you can plan activity, you can plan it. That's asking a lot for some people. But if you can figure out something that you and your child could do together and enjoy, for example, my family was having a rough time a couple of years ago, and I remember I decided to take my daughter to go get dessert at McNally Robinson, and we took pictures. And now, even now, she'll look back at those pictures, and we can talk about going to the restaurant and having a special dessert together. Visual clues are really helpful. Some families tried using photo albums, for example, or Google Drive, like Google Photos. If you're like us, or if other parents are like us, we take a fair number of photos, and they all end up in our Google Photo account, and my daughter loves to scroll through them and look at them and talk about them. And so that's a perfect opportunity to talk about how we were feeling in those events. This is just a beautiful example of modeling. Mom decided to tell her son a story about something that had happened when she was younger. And while it's good to share stories that you've both experienced, it's not bad to share stories of your own past. So this mom said, okay, I want to tell you something about flamingos as well. Did you know my favorite stuffy used to be a flamingo? Oh, yeah, because it's beautiful. This little guy really likes looking at pictures of birds. And Mom says, yeah, but did you know I used to have a stuffy, a big stuffy, a flamingo stuffy? And he says, yeah, you told us. Oh, and do you know who gave it to me? Who? My mom. It was her last stuffy present for me, so I loved it. And I kept it for years and years and years. It reminded me of my mom's love, and then I don't know what happened to it. My dear flamingo, I can't recall, but I loved it. And you see how she's really emphasizing the emotion in this story. This is the point. She loved it because it was from her mom. And her son says, maybe it got thrown in the garbage since you were turning something. Maybe, no, maybe I gave it away. I don't know, but I liked it. And now look at the child's response. When it's near Christmas, make a letter to Santa saying, Dear Santa, I want a big pink flamingo stuffy. And then he added, I know I'm an adult. I just remember the love of my mother. So he totally got the point. And what a beautiful moment for them to remember. And here's another one. Again, Mom talking about her past, but in connection to her child's experience. Her son had just said they'd practiced bus evacuation that day and asked for clarification. That's when you practice getting off the bus. Yeah. I know how without even holding a grade 5's hand. So he's saying, I don't need help with this. I can do it. I just jump off. You just jump? I remember doing that when I was a kid. So there's her connection. And I used to be one of the kids who helped the younger kids off the bus. And then he says, when I'm in grade 5, I get to help people. He also got the emotional point of her memory. So as I said, making use of sensory springboards. This was really helpful for those who used it. There was one conversation where a parent was going through a scrapbook, and it was clear that they were looking at pictures. There was one family who decided to go back to the restaurant where the story had happened, which was really interesting. And they were just remembering a time when Mom had lost her voice and they were trying to have a conversation and they were laughing because she couldn't speak. That was the story. and that for her, how frustrating it was that she couldn't speak, but it was also funny. And so mom decided to take her son actually to the restaurant in order to talk about that event. So there would be food connections there, place connection, but all of these things can be helpful as memory triggers and the start of a good conversation. And here comes the tricky step. Once you've got a child talking, because all of these things leading up to this are about you modeling, about the child hearing good examples of storytelling, of emotional connection, they start to talk at some point. Sometimes they talk a lot without coming to a point, but that doesn't mean you can't still be a listener and help to shape that conversation. And the body of research says there are two elements to this. One is that parents and caregivers and teachers can use elaboration, which actually just means adding a little bit more information to what the child is giving you. This is the same principle as, if a child typically uses 2 words in their utterances, then you want to use 3. You want to just give them a little bit more than what they're already doing. And the other piece is autonomy support. Big fancy word. All that really means is you're helping them say what they want to say. So you're not trying to direct the conversation. You're trying to see where they want to go and help them go there. And the third thing is that emotion shift, the high point. You really, really want to listen for those emotional shifts and spotlight them. Because what we found is some kids, you could find them, but the child himself wasn't recognizing what they were. I'm thinking particularly of one child who liked to talk to his mom about what happened to him at school all day. And you could tell in his voice that he was proud of an assignment he had done, or he was proud of something he made in art class. But he just kept going and talked so fast that he didn't have time to dwell on it, and mom might miss that moment. It was an opportunity for her to say, oh, that's really quite a great accomplishment that you made there. But that's what we want to listen for. So actually, not just 2 things, but 3 things that we can work on. And this is why it's hard for parents to hold all of this in their head sometimes, but we can start with what they're ready for. And they are kind of interconnected, to be honest. Speaking to the autonomy support piece, going where the child wants to go. One parent said she noticed that when they were talking about something her child was interested in, you could see it in his eye. This boy tended to leave the room if he wasn't interested, if he felt uncomfortable or insecure. But there were a couple of conversations where mom did a really good job of this, of holding on to what he wanted to talk about and shaping that a little bit. And he stayed, and he had a lot to say. So just to talk a little bit more about the elaboration piece, there are a lot of different ways to describe elaborations, a lot of different forms they can take. And this is the thing that I was looking for in my quantitative research. So I wanted to see, based on the McCabe study, could parents increase their use of elaboration? That was the key descriptor, the benchmark that she was using in that original study. So it was an important one for me. And this is a list of what they are. So do you remember when is one way. Open-ended questions. But a lot of the things I read and a lot of what I observed pointed to the idea that you really have to be sparing with questions, because if you ask too many, that becomes really directive. So you have to be careful to make your questions be in response to what a child has already said. Follow-up prompts and back channel responses. That just means things that, yeah, oh, really? That kind of comment. Making comments about the story, like, oh, you must have been proud about that. Or, I like the color red, I'm glad you used that. Or, that must have been really scary or exciting. And confirmations and negations are also considered elaboration. So just agreeing or or making a correction. Actually, we weren't at the Forks, we were at Assiniboine Park. That would be a negation. And this is also another important thing that's easy to miss, that we did share with parents, is that sometimes you just have to wait, because often kids have a slower processing time. They need to be able to think before they respond. And so we did advise parents to to give their child a chance to respond without moving on. So with all of that said, Rufus's mother, her response at the end was that all of this really made her reflect and realize the importance of just having conversations when, as a parent, you are turned off. You turn yourself off of all the other things that you need to do and just focus. In the busyness and craziness that happens in everyday life, sometimes when I talk to my kids, I'm just skimming. But this is with me and Rufus at bedtime. It's really connecting. All of this, holding all of these ideas in your head, takes a lot of mental energy. And I really take my hat off to the parents who participated in this study, because they worked really hard, most of them. Some of them struggled a bit with what we asked them to do, and I'll address that again in a little bit. But I tried this myself. I had 2 children in my own home that I could work on this with, and it took me a long time to not just understand all these pieces of conversational support, but also to consistently use them. And I found that it's exactly like Rufus's mother just described. It's about focus. And so you do really need to pick a time when this is what your focus is. It's not something that you can stay focused on all through the day, I found. How are we doing for time? I have a couple of stories here just to illustrate the difference between directive and responsive conversations, the difference between autonomy support and not having autonomy support. And these conversations came out of an article that I read, but they made me laugh because they're so typical of sometimes what we hear as we ourselves doing as we speak with children. And you can see in this conversation that the mom was really quite directive. Child says, "I fed the lion." An autonomous response, an elaborative response would be to follow that. So it could be a question of, what did you feed the lion? Or maybe he was hungry. You could leave a comment and see what the child says next. But instead, the mother decides to switch topics and say, "What animal did you play with first? What about the giraffe?" And the child went with it, but he didn't go with it very willingly. And so this is when we get frustrated, is when we have an idea in our head of what we want kids to talk about and what we want them to say and how we want them to say it, and then they don't. But what happens when we use elaboration and autonomy support and emotion shifts is something more like this. So in this conversation, the child starts by talking about a lost baby elephant. And mother asks for more information. "Why were you looking for him?" "I was the zookeeper." And then the mother brings in an emotion shift. "I bet the zookeeper was worried about the baby elephant. What did you do to try to find him?" And then the child, "I talked to the giraffe." Okay, now he's shifted again a little bit, so mom goes with it. "What else did you do with the giraffe?" "I brushed his fur." Oh, another emotion shift. He must have liked that. His fur was all matted and stuck together. And then child switches again a little bit. But mom is following the child's lead, and this conversation is a lot more peaceful and enjoyable for the child. And he shares a fair bit. Okay, so I think I put that in twice by mistake. Step 5, and this was a hard one too, is self-reflection and self-evaluation. So asking parents to listen to their own recordings and think about what kind of language they're using, what kind of signals they're giving their child, whether they're modeling or not. It was a really valuable step for the parents who did it. Not all did. I would say the more successful parents were the ones who did this. Moving right along. Here's what Nathan and Dave Donald's mother said about that. When I hear my recordings, I catch myself still making questions, formulating questions, but maybe that's a natural part of conversations. But then I recall, okay, instead of just bombarding them with questions, I start sharing things, and then they naturally start sharing things. So she listened to her own recordings. She realized she was using a lot of questions, maybe more than she should, and started sharing ideas instead, and felt it worked. And it did. You can hear it in the recordings. So after all that, what is the summary of what parents need to do? Listen to yourself telling stories, pay attention to your own emotion shifts, start to model in simple ways, and use springboards, highlight the emotion shifts, and then practice listening for what your child wants to tell you and help them say more. That's essentially what we ask parents to do. So the findings. It took me a long time to code all these conversations. I had about 150 conversations, something like that. And so what I was looking at, I looked at a whole lot of things that would take me too long to explain here. But my primary observation was about parents using elaboration instead of just directive statements. And so what I found with that is that if parents were not using elaboration at the baseline conversations, then what typically happened is they increased their use of elaboration quite significantly. For example, Luke's mom there went from 4% to 45%. If they were already using a fair bit of elaboration, then it either dropped or stayed the same, which is maybe not such a bad thing, considering there's probably a limit to how many elaborative statements you can pack into a conversation anyway. And there were other changes that were observed in these parents. The other thing, like on the question of can parents learn new listening habits? Well, the answer is yes, but something that came up with several families is resilience. There were some that were struggling a bit in their personal lives, either with time management or just with stress in general. Some told their stories to me. Some just told me that they were having difficulty. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, that if you're asking parents to change their behavior, they need to be in a place where they have room to grow. And I can relate to that because I have gone back to working full time this year, and I'm thinking of my, now friends from this study who told me about some of their struggles, and I totally get it because I'm having trouble myself. My mind is focused on starting a new stage of my career, and it's hard to focus on my kids. And I'm sure that'll change again, but it is definitely something to keep in mind. Second question was, any changes noted in the children? Were there any initial changes in the way children were behaving in conversation? And the answer is yes, for some of them at least. Several children in the study were noticeably engaging in conversation more than they ever had before. So at least engagement changed. There were 2 children whose parents noted that their verbal reasoning was already improving. One of them was, there were several examples caught in recorded conversations where I was surprised and kind of astonished at the difference in the way that he was talking about why things happen compared to what he was doing at the beginning. What I also noticed is that this is definitely about remembering together. There were almost no examples of children just telling a story. It was always in the context of a conversation. There were also some children who were not enjoying this process, especially being recorded. We had gone through a process of asking for both consent and assent. And we did explain to the children that they'd be recording conversations with their parents and sharing them with me. When it actually came time to do it, there were a handful of children who were quite uncomfortable with that. And a couple of them just stopped doing it, which is appropriate. A couple of them maybe were more selective in what they were willing to share. But we definitely paid attention to what children were comfortable with. And if somebody needed to stop, they stopped. So that was something to think about too. So I think it's huge that most families did establish a routine of having conversation time and a time to just focus on the events of their day or on their feelings or on just on connecting with each other. And that's what parents talked about the most. Several parents did start to model storytelling in a way that I could recognize in recordings. This idea of authenticity was really important because it was hard for some parents to switch from a conversation style where they were kind of quizzing their child about their day and then moving to a more genuine autonomy support style conversation. But most parents did use fewer questions, which meant that the conversation style shifted away from really directive and facilitated towards a more mutual back and forth kind of style. Emotion shifts did change for some parents, but not as much as I'd hoped. And sometimes parents use sensory springboards, like going to the restaurant or using photographs, but also, again, not as much as I'd hoped. I think because it takes planning, and planning means more time and effort. Considering this is an example of the child that I talked about who started to use more verbal reasoning. They went to the trampoline park, Mom says, and the rule is one person per trampoline, and Ivor broke the rules, and Mom said, remember, one person per trampoline. Mama, I was just passing through. And she was so happy that he could explain himself. He could advocate for himself. I didn't do the wrong thing. I wasn't staying there. And that's big. Parents all had positive feedback. There was one parent whose feedback was a bit mixed, and she was the parent of one of the children who wasn't enjoying being recorded. But she said that she enjoyed spending more time with her son, at the very least. And all of the others said that this was a very positive thing to try with their children. The children, as I said, were diverse. Some said they really liked having story time with their mom or dad. They really liked the attention. They liked hearing stories from their parents' past. But others clearly really didn't like the recording part. Here's an example of feedback from one of the parents of children who were already fairly higher level in terms of language development. She said, my son's been a talker as long as he had words, but I felt our exchanges became more meaningful. And he was more willing to open up about issues at school that in the past he would have kept bottled up. We're starting to work on sequence of events. And I often notice when he's telling me about school, he will often pause to reflect and organize his thoughts. I noticed with this child too, he often drew conclusions when he was talking with his parents. Like he'd be talking about how hard he had to work in order to learn to do a handstand. And then he'd conclude something like, practicing a lot is a good thing because you learn to do new things. And that was really great. I like this one too. I'm rediscovering my son. I didn't know how to make him talk. He loves listening to my memories and experiences, and he is more eager to share his own experiences and ideas and even philosophies about life. So that was neat. This was really cool because this is one of the families where the child really hated being recorded, but he consented to a couple. And this was one of the ones where this is at the tail end of a recording. And dad is really excited about what they have been talking about and thanking his son. And the son says, Next time we'll talk about something else. And then he says, we'll talk more often. Instead of my brother on his own playing by himself and dad on his Facebook or doing his work and I'm in my book, we should socialize more often. And to have a child who's been kind of on his own and not willing to communicate, actually verbalize that desire, I think is really, really significant. And here's just one more, another mother talking about how her son has become more affectionate and likes to snuggle and talk, which is obviously something we want as parents. We love to connect with our kids. This is just a quick reference that this is something we gave parents to stick on their fridge or on the visor of their car. But this is what we're asking them to do. Retell events that have happened, elaborate, acknowledge your child's response, ask a few questions, let your child take the lead, and link events to emotions. And even doing some of these things, I think, was helpful. So just final conclusions. I don't think it's ever too late to support language development. That's something that came out of this for me. And the connection between parent resilience and wellness and the success of an intervention was really important. If parents aren't feeling well, if mental health is not strong, then it's going to be hard for them to do an intervention. The biggest, I think, most valuable outcome for parents was the emotional connection that they felt with their kids. And the other thing is that this kind of intervention can be used anywhere. I'm a teacher now, and I had a conversation with a parent last week who was experiencing some, parent and child experiencing some mental health issues related to COVID. And her comment was, I think I need to make time to talk with my child and really hear what he has to say. And I said, well, I have something to tell you about. Sent her an article. He's not on the autism spectrum, but this is something that every child needs. Every child needs to connect with the people around them. And these strategies can be used with any child, not just kids with autism. And that's all I have for you. I hope that was intelligible and helpful and of interest. And if you want a summary of my research, or if you want, I made a guide for parents to follow. If anyone's interested in having a copy of that, you're welcome to email me and I will be happy to send it to you.